Unit 4 continues the examination of ISA 315 revised by focusing on the auditor's responsibilities in respect of the identification and assessment of risks relating to internal controls at the planning stage of the audit. Remember from Unit 1, the audit risk model outlined that the auditor's responsibility is to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment, the inherent risks, including the entity's internal control relevant to the audit, which relate to control risks. This is the focus of Unit 4. Therefore, obtaining an understanding of the controls helps the auditor to identify factors that affect the risks of material misstatement. The auditor can then design further audit procedures to address these risks. Unit 4 covers the following key topics: entity level controls, assessing IT risks and controls, process level controls, and the auditor's responsibility when a client uses a service organisation. The first three topics discussed in Unit 4 are summarised as follows. Most auditors use a top-down approach in obtaining an understanding of controls. A top-down approach requires the auditor to first understand the overall risks relating to the financial statements as a whole. The auditor then evaluates the design and implementation of those controls that relate to the financial statements as a whole. These controls are referred to as entity-level controls in this module. After understanding the entity-level controls, the auditor obtains an understanding of control activities. These controls are referred to as process-level controls in this module. And examples of these process-level controls are controls in the sales, purchasing, or payroll processes. As we obtain an understanding of the entity level and process level controls, we cannot do this in isolation of obtaining an understanding of IT and assessing IT risks and controls, and ensuring the 5 components of internal control are addressed as required by ISA 315 revised. These 5 components are the control environment, risk assessment process, information system, including the related business processes relevant to financial reporting and communication, control activities, and monitoring of controls. We'll work through this diagram in more detail, starting with the first key topic, which is entity level controls. As we just mentioned, the auditor has a responsibility to evaluate the design of entity-level controls and whether the controls have been implemented. To do this evaluation, we need to understand what entity-level controls are. Entity-level controls are implemented by senior management to mitigate business risks. Entity-level controls are put in place to ensure that the entity as a whole is operating effectively and efficiently. While these controls do not directly prevent or detect and correct errors or fraud, they have an impact on controls operating at a process level. For this reason, auditors consider entity-level controls early in the audit process because the results of the evaluation of entity-level controls can impact on the audit strategy and the audit plan. Entity-level controls typically include the following elements of the 5 components of an entity's internal control. Controls relating to the control environment. This is often referred to as the tone at the top. That is management's attitude, awareness, and actions concerning the importance of internal control. A weak control environment increases the risk that employees will bypass, override, or breach any controls that an entity has in place. In contrast, a strong control environment and ethical culture is a contributing factor to preventing fraud and critical to sound financial reporting. Entity-level controls also include controls relating to the risk assessment process. This is management's formal and informal process for identifying and assessing and managing business risks and risks of fraud. This is a necessary process for management to fulfill its responsibilities. Entity-level controls also include controls relating to communication, which is part of the information systems component. Communication involves providing staff an understanding of their roles and responsibilities relating to financial reporting. Effective communication is usually strongly linked with a control environment and applies to the entity as a whole. Last but not least, entity-level controls also include monitoring of controls. Management must have ways of monitoring whether the entity's internal control is functioning as designed and is addressing any deficiencies to ensure its controls are and continue to be effective. Remember, the auditor must evaluate the design and implementation of entity-level controls and does this by making inquiries supported by other procedures such as observation or inspection. For example, the auditor could review the minutes of the board and audit committee meetings and actually attend audit committee meetings too. It's worth pointing out that the other component, control activities, will typically refer to process level controls, which we'll go through shortly. But before we go on to control activities, we'll now discuss the auditor's need to understand IT and assess IT risks and controls, which is a key part of the information system component of internal control. To comply with the requirements of ISA 315 revised in regard to obtaining an understanding of the information system, the auditor must obtain an understanding of the following three elements: IT policies and procedures, such as those that govern access to programs and data, the IT department, and IT infrastructure and IT software applications. These three factors influence the general IT controls and IT application controls. General IT controls are policies and procedures that relate to many applications and support the effective functioning of IT application controls. They are controls that maintain the integrity of information and security of data over the data center and network operations, system software acquisition, change and maintenance, program change, access security, application system acquisition, development and maintenance. The auditor focuses on the key general IT controls that support the effective functioning of IT application controls that the auditor plans to rely on. In practice, auditors focus on GITCs over program change and access security, as these are the GITCs relevant to performing a financial statement audit. In practice, the management of IT access can present a significant risk that the auditor needs to address. IT application controls are controls over the specific IT applications, for example, the sales application used in the sales process. IT application controls operate over input, processing, or output of data. Examples of such controls include edit checks, validations, calculations, and automated authorization controls. In simple terms, general IT controls would operate at the entity level, whereas IT application controls would operate at the process level controls. If GITCs are not in place, then it may be pointless to assess ITACS, IT application controls, that is. So what's the point of checking IT controls in the sales application, for example, if changes have been made to the sales program without proper authorization? This leads us nicely into the third key topic of Unit 4, which is process level controls. And as mentioned earlier, this focuses on the control activities component. Process level controls are policies and procedures designed by management that are applied to the entity's processes to ensure that information recorded is accurate, complete, and reliable. Remember, the auditor's focus is on obtaining an understanding of controls relevant to the audit. The auditor first identifies the business processes of the entity, e.g. sales process or payroll process, and how transactions flow through the information system, including the specific IT applications used by the entity. This understanding is typically obtained by the auditor by performing a walkthrough. A walkthrough follows a single transaction through the entity's processes in order to understand the flow of the transaction from start to finish, including the risks in the process and the controls put in place to mitigate the risk. This typically involves understanding how transactions are initiated, authorized, recorded, processed, corrected where necessary, transferred and reconciled to the general ledger, and reported in the financial statements. The auditor would also consider the following control activities: authorization, performance review, reconciliation, physical control, e.g. stocktake, and segregation of duties. These control activities may be manual and/or IT applications. The types of process level controls we've just outlined are provided with examples in this quick reference guide in Unit 4. So after obtaining an understanding of controls, this will inform the auditor's decision about the audit strategy, such as whether a controls-based approach should be taken for a process, and if so, which controls should be selected for testing. The auditor will also need to consider whether any design deficiencies or control improvements need to be communicated to those charged with governance and, where appropriate, to management in accordance with ISA 265. The final key topic covered in Unit 4 is the auditor's responsibility when a client uses a service organisation. Where a client uses a service organisation, ISA 402 requires the auditor to understand the services provided by the service organisation and the effect of those services on the client's internal controls relevant to the audit. The auditor must obtain this understanding in order to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement and to be able to respond to those risks. Once this understanding of the services is obtained, the auditor must understand the controls the client has implemented over the services provided. If the client has sufficient controls in place on which the auditor is able to rely, regardless of the controls at the service organisation, the risk assessment is complete and therefore the auditor does not need to consider the controls at the service organisation. However, if the auditor does not gain sufficient understanding of the client entity from the information located at the client entity, the auditor must then consider the controls and procedures in place at the service organisation. This additional information from the service organisation can be obtained by the auditor using a combination of the following. That sums up our overview of Unit 4. If you have any further questions regarding Unit 4, please post them on the discussion board. Thank you for watching this video, and look out for other overview videos for the other units in the AAA module. We wish you all the very best in your studies.